Welcome to Bird Burger. Almost a month ago, we hosted the 2023 Bird Burger photo competition, judged live here on YouTube. We had hundreds of outstanding submissions to the event, but if you watched, one image really stood out above the rest. Mike Gilling won first place in our creative category, but also went on to win the title of 2023 Bird Burger Photographer of the Year, with his image of the loon floating out on a forest lake on a misty morning. Today, it's my honor to have our guest on the channel, Mike Gilling. Mike, how are you doing today?
Hey, Jeremy, good. How are you? Thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be here with you.
Yeah, doing good. I'm excited for our conversation today. And yeah, we had a little over 650 photos submitted to the the second annual Bird Burger photo competition. The competition was really quite high this year, and overall, I undoubtedly noticed a step up from last year's competition in the quality of images that even made it to the finals. With your image in particular, I was amazed because in your shot, I could have never kind of envisioned the scene quite in the way that I felt like you did. And I was thinking to myself in that moment, kind of, there's no way I would have noticed that style of image and went for that kind of overexposure if I was looking at that scene in real life. So it was very impressive, and props to you on that. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your process in that image and how you captured it?
Yeah. So I'm not like a person who goes out and plans shots, right? I'm always looking for things, but I'm not like going to set up somewhere and wait for something to happen, right? I'm more of an opportunistic person. So on this particular shot, we were driving past a lake. I was on a photography trip with a few friends up in Canada. Driving past this lake, I spotted a couple loons nearby the shore, so we stopped and we got out and took pictures. And I took a couple pictures, kind of the standard portrait pictures, close up of a loon. They look great. They look good too, but just before we were leaving, I happened to glance out over the lake, and it was very early in the morning, pretty foggy, and happened to see one loon swimming away, and just took a shot. It wasn't super planned, or there's no like magic behind it really, but it's one of those things that like right place, right time, a little bit of luck involved, and it worked out good. And then, it was early in the morning. It was pretty dark, so it took. The image was dark to start with, right? So there's some editing to bring it up a little bit, but it's pretty realistic to what it was. So
yeah, no, that's incredible. Wow, yeah, that's awesome. Because I would have, I guess, looking at that image, I can see how it's not necessarily an image that you would expect a ton of planning with, but It is interesting to hear it was just like how you were saying, kind of right place, right time, because I mean, a lot of images come from the route of kind of like, very in detailed kind of planning and executing it. But then some images, it's just like, if you're in the right place at the right time and you kind of are ready and you have that kind of like eye for catching something like what you did, it can turn out incredible. So that's cool to hear.
Yeah.
What was kind of your story with, or maybe story or like your vision with an image like this? What was it that you hoped to kind of represent in the way you captured it?
That's a good question. I mean, with most of my images, I try to stay sort of realistic, right? I'm not using a ton of tools, right? There's a lot of amazing tools that have come out in recent days or recent years here. A lot of this AI stuff and processing things that can really change an image, right? I try to stay pretty close to that. And so, I'm just trying to show what was there, right? Undoubtedly, it's a little bit brighter than it was in the real scene, right? But it's as foggy as it was there. I'm just trying to show reality. And I tried to show sort of like a surreal or a serene moment, right? Where there's nothing around except you and the wildlife, right? And sort of this one loon out on the lake by itself, kind of. There was other ones, but it looks like that, right?
Yeah.
So just trying to show that kind of magic of wild, right? It's real life, it's real animals, right? It's not set up kind of stuff.
So in a situation like this, you're going for an overexposure, and it's a little bit more artistic of a take. It's a little bit more risky, I'd say. Do you ever miss shots because you're going for kind of a more creative take like this, or?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that like a lot of people miss out on, like in Instagram or all these, social media and stuff like that. You see one shot, or you see like just a couple curated things. And I don't know how many pictures I took of this one loon, right? But, in a day of driving around Jasper National Park, I might have taken 1,000 photos, right? And gotten 20 good ones out of there, maybe.
Yeah.
And then even less show up on my Instagram, So certainly you take a ton of photos and some of them work out. And since I'm not setting up in one spot and taking, all this time and setting everything up perfectly, right, there's a lot more trial and error or luck involved in it. So there's definitely some people who sit in one place, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just a different style of doing things, and just not how I did it for this one, and not generally how I do things for my photography.
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways to go about it. And just depends a lot on your scenario, what you're photographing, and so much more. Clearly, your image won the grand prize for the event out of 656 images that were submitted in total to the competition, which says something about, I feel, the level of artistry involved in this competition. What do you think it was about your photo that maybe made it stand out amongst the 656 competitors? That way, maybe someone watching this that competed this year or hopes to compete next year can kind of have some takeaway point of what maybe they can look for in their images.
That's a great question. I wish I could get inside the mind of all the judges, right, to figure out what exactly was the thing, right? But if I had to point to one thing, I'd think that it's just a little bit different, right? If you think about a wildlife photography shot, right, it's generally like a lot of detail, not necessarily close up, but it's very clear image, right? And the animal is like front and center. It's the main subject. To it. This image is a little bit more of like a landscape, less of a wildlife image. And I think even in your competition you had birdscapes as a category. I thought about entering this one in that category as well, but creative birdscapes, I don't know, is kind of a toss up. But I think just being different, right? It's an angle that people might have seen but not thought to photograph before. I'm sure I'm not the only one I've ever photographed something similar to this, but it's just a little bit different, I think.
I think that's really valuable. I listen to a lot of the feedback that I get for the competition. So I get after the competition last year, but a lot more so this year. I got a lot of feedback from people, like just giving their thoughts, and whatever.
Sure.
And I got one really interesting piece of feedback from someone that was, she was kind of trying to figure out like why it was that the judges went with. She noticed a lot of kind of like what she would describe as abstract or moody images or things like that maybe aren't your typical standard wildlife portraits. And my response to her was like, when you've been doing wildlife photography for so many years, like a lot of these judges have, you've seen 100 shots of the same blue jay on a stick up close, right? And so when you finally see that one shot where it's a blue jay, but it's in a different scene and it's, maybe there's more attention to the landscape around it, or maybe there's a certain use of like composition or foreground that's really interesting, or the lighting's very unique. It just stands out to you. And so, I think that's definitely something about this image that stands out is we had, I know off the top of my head, I'm trying to think, I know we had at least 5 loon images submitted to the competition, maybe 10 or so. And most of them took the more traditional routes of exposure and portraiture. But this one I think is really unique in how you captured it. So I love that. How long have you been doing wildlife photography, and how do you think that your experience has kind of shaped your vision through the eye of a camera today?
So the easy part first. How long have I been doing this? Probably about 2 years, if I had to guess, maybe a little bit more.
Wow.
Been like more sort of serious into wildlife photography for about that time. Before that, way back in high school, I did a lot of like motorsports photography. And so, dirt bikes and cars and stuff like that. But I took a big break during college when I didn't have a whole lot of time to be doing that stuff, and money was a problem. So, just in recent years, I'm, more established, have more time. So I picked up a camera again and started focusing on wildlife, and been loving it since then.
That's very impressive. So it sounds like you said you've been kind of focusing on wildlife photography for 2 years now, a little bit more intensively. But before that, it sounds like you also had a background in photography through other experiences. That's still very impressive, though. I'm surprised. I mean, I feel like a lot of times it does take quite a bit of experience and almost getting like the jitters out of your system in terms of like not being too nervous to take the risks like you took in your shot.
Sure.
So that's very impressive that you've only been doing it 2 years more intensively, and you were able to pull that off. So I think that's a really cool encouragement to probably a lot of people watching.
Yeah, I don't think you have to do this for, I mean, not to belittle anybody who's been doing it for a long time, right? But
Yeah.
it's not like you can only make good pictures if you've been doing it for 10 years, right? That you can still do it. It just takes practice and time being out in the field. And one other thing I didn't add earlier is that, along with my photography background, and, some people may or may not like this, I did a lot of hunting when I was younger.
Yeah.
And so I've spent a lot of time in the field watching animals. And I stopped hunting because I realized I liked watching the animals more than doing the hunting part. So I've stopped doing that, but sort of traded for photography. But you spend a lot of time watching animals, understanding how they move, what they pay attention to, what they're doing. And I think that can help a lot more than certainly the technical abilities and skill to use the camera is a big thing, but understanding how an animal lives, how it's moving through its environment is really important as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you're definitely right about that. Understanding, predicting where the animal's going to be, when it's going to be there, can lead to huge success with your photography. And you can be incredibly talented with a camera, but not understand the natural world and its behaviors, and it could be very challenging. So you're definitely right about that. So what does a normal day look like for you when you're doing wildlife photography then? It sounds like you have a lot of experience out in nature and stuff. So what does that kind of look like?
So I do this purely as a hobby. And so a normal day for me is going to work.
Yeah.
And then, after work, sometimes I'll take some time, bring my camera to work with me, and then go off after somewhere to a local pond or something. Most of the time that's what I'm doing, right? Is just, 20, 30 minutes around where I live and taking pictures at ponds and stuff like that. When I'm doing something more on purpose, like this trip to Canada was a photography trip, right? When we were in Jasper, when I took this picture, it was wake up very early in the morning. I don't know what time I took this picture, but it was early. Wake up early and start driving. And we would just drive for most of the day looking for animals. And I took a video on my camera, or on my phone when we were doing that, because I thought it was kind of an interesting, most of your day taking photos of wildlife is either sitting doing nothing or driving around not seeing anything. You do all of this for this really small portion of time where you're actually taking a picture, actually seeing an animal. But so, I mean, there's a lot of, it depends on how you're doing it, right? But I do a lot of driving around, looking for stuff, or walking around, looking for stuff. Some people will sit around and wait, but I'm not patient enough for that. So
yeah, that's interesting. I can relate to that now that I went to Yellowstone this past summer for the first time, and where I have always done wildlife photography has been the very opposite of that, where I drive to a location, I park, and then the whole rest of the time I'm out on foot doing whatever, whether that's hiking around to find them or that's waiting around, whatever, so on and so forth. But I had never done the whole driving and looking thing until I went to Yellowstone, because it's a whole different culture there and a different way that wildlife kind of works over there. And it was a whole different experience. So it was fun kind of getting to experience that world. But what do you think the value is of community then in wildlife photography? You talked about you went up on this photography trip with a couple other guys, and it sounds like you were all doing photography. What do you think the value is of community, whether it comes to something like that, or maybe even something like the photo competition that you won?
It's an interesting question. I think community is really important, but you have to be careful with how you use community. There's a famous quote, and I can't remember right now who said it, but the quote is, "Comparison is the thief of joy," right? Or something to that effect, right? So if you use community just to compare yourself to everybody else, right, that can be a very negative thing, and it doesn't seem to work out, right? But if you're using community to learn and to meet people and enjoy the thing you're doing more, that can be extremely helpful, right? And I think with the photo competition, it was great because we could see the live judging happen, and there was people talking on the sides, reacting to the stuff. That's really great. I've met people through photography. The people that I went on this trip were from another photography group, and So I met them through that, and we went on a trip to Canada, which was incredible. I probably wouldn't have done that trip had I not met those people. So I think the community is super important, right? And I've also, engaged things on Reddit. Like there's a page on there called Photo Critique, which is, when I was starting out and trying to learn how to do editing and see what people liked, what people didn't like. Spent a lot of time posting on there, learning from other people, and also like giving back to community too, because it's a two-way street. You can't just take constantly, right? So I would also give critiques and help people out and, give opinions on things, but always try to be cautious of not getting caught up in the comparison game or, putting somebody down for something you didn't like that maybe they liked a lot, right? So
yeah,
it can go, it's always like a trade-off, right?
Yeah, I really like a lot of the things you were saying. It's a very fine line between a healthy competitive atmosphere, but it doesn't even have to be competitive. It could just be atmosphere of like, I don't know the word for it. There's probably a better word, but like constructive criticism, right? There's always a fine balance between that and then like comparison being the thief of joy, like you mentioned. Right. And so I love that you bring that up. But I think that it shows, I think like you having the vision with your image, for example, to be able to do something like that, that's not, I would argue to say that that's not something that someone with 2 years of experience in wildlife photography would normally go after, which I think shows a lot in regards to, it's interesting to hear you kind of say how you've been on these Reddit forums and, you've searched for some sort of feedback. And I'm sure that's done a lot in terms of escalating your growth in a way that you wouldn't have gotten if you didn't have that community and you weren't kind of open to growth and feedback. And so that's very cool on your end, being willing to do that. That's something with the competition that I really hope to do well. Like that's one of the reasons why I actually kind of started it. Was because when I was looking around at the competition space, I love a healthy, fun competition. Like, sure. I think that there's something very exciting about it. I think it's an incredible way to bond people together. Like I grew up playing like board games with my family all the time, right? And it's competitive and we're like getting into it. But at the end of the day, like we are more bonded, like we get to develop like a fun relationship together. And it's also kind of good to be able to learn how to like take losses in life and kind of move on from that, right? And grow. And so with the competition, I kind of looked around at the space and I was seeing all these competitions out there. And I was like, you know what all these competitions is missing is the community aspect. Because so many competitions are all about just the award, the prizes, and like the winner. But what it is missing is this community space to come together, kind of like a town square, and all enjoy something together. And so, yeah, that was definitely a large vision and hope behind the competition that I created. So
yeah, I think you did a good job with it. It was fun.
Thank you. What was your kind of opinion of the competition, and what was your thoughts about it?
It was great. I mean, there were so many good images there. I'm honestly surprised that I won, because there was other ones that personally I would have picked over my own, right? But not trying to be like overly humble, but I mean there were so many good pictures. It was great.
Phenomenal ones. Yeah.
And so that was, first of all, right, it was a good competition because there's a lot of good pictures, right? And having the community on the side, and I love the idea of having like the judged photos, and then, having the community vote, right? That brings everybody back into it. Yeah. Because you can have these judges who have been doing this for so long, and they have like a very specific vision of what photos should be. And a lot of them, maybe not all of them, but do photography somewhat more commercially than a lot of other people do, right? So they have this sort of like commercial vision of what an image should be. And where the community, some of them might be commercial, but not all of them are. So a lot of them might have a very different view on like what a good image is or what attracts them to an image, right? And that's not always the same thing as what the judges were. And we saw that a number of times, so that was great. It was really fun to watch the whole time.
Yeah, most definitely. I love that. And yeah, when you've been, a lot of them who have been doing it for so long, right? You kind of get like sometimes you can get so much caught into like the needing to see something new, like we were talking about before,
Right.
where you can kind of almost forget like the simple fundamental aspects of a photo that really make it shine. And so I thought it was very interesting that, like, for example, the fox image
I love that one.
I'm trying to remember her name. I cannot remember her name. But yeah, that image was incredible as well. But that image was by far the most loved in the popular vote, right, for the whole event.
Yeah.
But knowing the judges' scores and all of that, it definitely wasn't one of the ones that was going to place in the portrait category. I'll just say that.
Right.
But it is so interesting to see kind of that contrast, right? Of like, sometimes you can get so just far kind of caught up into doing the same thing and then like trying to look for something different and creative and unique that you forget the simple aspects of a photo that can make it really shine, like that fox image, that simple, tender moment of those foxes together and the way they were posing and kind of their composition as subjects, really just made that photo shine. So I love that.
One thing that I want to add to that too, the fox photo, I think one thing that sets that apart too is that foxes are not easy to go take pictures of, and I think a lot of like professional wildlife photographers lose that sort of reality because they're out there doing this all the time. They've seen it before, but like I don't know how many people who don't do this professionally have just gone out and seen a fox in the wild. Unless you set up and like know where they are and stuff, it's pretty hard to do. So I think that adds to it, and I think that helps with like the popular vote, right? This is something that people just don't see every day. You know, you might see a fox run across the street, but to see two kits kind of hugging like they were, I mean, that was great.
Yeah,
I certainly picked it as my vote. So.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, it's you kind of can lose the magic of the wildlife subject over time.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I love that. Yeah. Well, no, those are some awesome thoughts. Thank you for sharing that. I often like to ask the question of what a wildlife photographer considers to be the most important thing to know in wildlife photography. So what's maybe, if you had to give one tip or one piece of advice to everyone watching, what would be the most single most important tip to placing in a wildlife photography competition from your perspective in the future?
That's a great question. I'm going to separate into two pieces. So one of them would be just wildlife photography in general, and then one will be maybe for the competition. But
great.
In general, I think in wildlife photography, the most important thing you can think about or do is pay attention to the ethics of what you're doing, right? And that like, there's so many aspects into that, and we could spend 3 hours having a conversation about the ethics of photography, right? But thinking about like how you're affecting the animals, how they're being affected by other people around, leave no trace, all that kind of stuff is extremely important. If you're doing anything that like pushes an animal away or scares it off, right, maybe you shouldn't have done that. Obviously there's some scenarios where you can't avoid that, right? Birds just fly away, right? That just happens, right? But if you're constantly pushing a bird or a bear or whatever to move over and over and over again, probably shouldn't be doing that, right? So thinking about that ethics, I think, is the most important thing. There's no shot that's worth more than like the life of an animal or your own life for that matter, right? If you do the wrong things around certain animals, it can go poorly for you too. So avoid that. But I think that's probably the most important thing, right? Everybody wants to get a great shot, but if other people are ruining it for everybody else, then it doesn't work out, right? And for the competitions, it's hard to pick one thing, but if I could pick one, I think it would be to just be yourself and don't dwell too much on like not winning or not being the first photo.
That's good.
And that's like a super cliche thing, especially for somebody who just won a competition to say. But it's real, right? Like, I've entered numerous competitions, right, and only won one of them, right?
Yeah.
But there's no reason to get down on yourself. Everybody has different opinions on what photos are good or bad, and it's super subjective. So, if you like it, great, hang it on your wall. If it doesn't win a competition, who cares? It's nice to win competitions, don't get me wrong. But that's not the main goal. It shouldn't be the main goal. So do what you like to do. I
love that.
Enjoy it first.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I haven't, funny enough, for hosting a competition, I haven't submitted to too many yet, but I have submitted twice ever to some, one time to Beat Body, one time to the Audubon Awards. And in Beachbody, for 1 year, I got shortlisted, but didn't wind up placing or anything. Audubon, I didn't even make the finalist list that year. I'm trying to remember. I don't think, maybe I did. I can't even remember, to be honest. But regardless, I didn't win,
Sure.
which is what it comes down to. And that's something actually, as I was reflecting on this year as I was hosting, I was like, man, I need to get into more competitions next year because like I'm hosting this thing, like I got to get myself more out there. Ultimately it just comes down to like, did you do the best you can? And that's something to be proud of in and of itself, I think. So.
Yeah.
I love that you shared that, and it's cool to be able to look at other people's images when you feel confident enough about your own work and you know you did the best you can for where you're at in life, right? Maybe you can't afford the best gear yet, so this is as good as you could have gotten in that moment, or maybe it just, you don't have the same opportunities as someone else, don't have the same amount of time to commit to the craft. There's so many factors, and so as long as you're feeling like this is the best I can do in the moment, that's a great feeling to kind of be at. So you did also mention, I'd love to talk about that just for a second. I wasn't necessarily planning on it today, but
sure.
You did mention ethics. Would you mind sharing a little bit on, I guess, some of your perspective of how you approach ethics when you're personally out in the field?
Yeah, I don't think it takes like a huge amount of work to be a little bit more ethical, right? A little bit more thoughtful of what you're doing. It just means putting in like a little bit of thought before you do something. So if you're sitting for a long time or just going for a walk, don't leave any trash behind, right? Carry everything in or carry everything out that you carry in, right? So if you're eating a granola bar or something, bring the wrapper out. These things are like super obvious sometimes when you think about it, but it just takes a little bit extra work to think about it at a time and then do something about it. You mentioned you were at Yellowstone. I'm sure when you were there, you ran into a couple bear jams, right? Or bear traffic jams. Maybe people don't know what that is. It's great to like see the animals and be a part of that and take pictures, but don't like feed into the problem. It's far too often that I see videos that pop up of like, the tagline will be "dumb tourist gets too close to buffalo and gets trampled," right? Or like you'll see a picture of like 300 people around one grizzly bear and they're all very close to it, right? Like, even though the bear is not reacting or the animal's not reacting immediately, right, that changes how they see the world around them. And so like try not to feed too much into that. It's not you can't avoid every scenario, right? But
yeah,
I don't know, you can do some things to help it. When we were in Canada, there was a scenario where we had a grizzly on the side of the road that it was a mess, let's just put it that way. There were so many cars around, and Parks Canada was on the scene very quickly, which is great. They were there to make sure everybody was safe and keep everybody under control. But there was a good line of cars that were on the opposite side of the road or a fair distance away from the bear, but one car pulled like right next to the bear. I mean, 15 feet away from a grizzly bear and cubs. And there was a lady hanging out the top that, she didn't get attacked. Great. I'm glad she didn't get attacked there, but man, she was way too close. And it's both dangerous for her and dangerous for the bear. Like I said in the beginning, it doesn't take a lot of work. It just takes a little bit of forethought and get in, take your picture. Don't mess things up, but then leave. Don't sit on an animal forever, because even you just being there will move them, change what they're going or where they're going and stuff. Yeah.
What do you think the relationship is then between getting I'm trying to think of my question, between getting involved with nature, getting excited about nature, partaking in kind of this natural, state of the world that we've kind of, separated from now with our society and our civilization. What do you think the level of involvement that we as humans should be in terms of with our natural environment, as opposed to kind of where we are and kind of staying? Because, right, I guess my question comes from this place. Let me just say this. It can be easy at the same time to be like, okay, like we don't want to disturb nature. Now we're like going to completely remove our hands. We're going to stay in our cities and, stay in our concrete jungles, which is overall could have less impact, right? And especially in the short term would have less impact, but also might in the long term have a worse impact because people are less connected with the world around them. They care less about the world around them, all of that, versus people who are out in nature a lot tend to care a lot more about nature. How do you kind of, I guess, what's your philosophy in terms of like, how do you kind of manage that dance and how do you kind of live in the middle of that dance?
Yeah. It's a tricky balance. It's hard to discuss, right? It seems like everything in this world has become very like polarized. Mm-hmm. You can either do this or do this. You can't like be in the middle, or at least that's what the opinions are. But I don't think that's exactly true. You definitely like you said, like just sitting in a city and not ever going out in nature doesn't fix the problem really. Now you start losing like reality of what nature is or what it needs, so you're not actually out there. And I'm not some huge nature buff, right? I'm not outside all the time, but I just thought about it a couple times.
Enough. Yeah.
Right. Enough. So there, it's a balance, like everything. It's about being out there, learning about what's out there, leaving no trace, not affecting the stuff, within reason, right? Like we have roads that go all over the place. There's trails that go all over the place, right? But if a trail says stay on the trail, then maybe stay on the trail, right? And so there's, I don't know, it's just thinking ahead to how are you going to affect things, right? And trying to minimize it is different than doing nothing, right? So minimizing your impact is very important. There's probably not any way you can have zero impact. So like, just try to be better. I think if everybody tries a little bit to be better, we'll be in a much better situation, right?
Yeah.
Things will improve, right? It's not that everybody has to be 100% better than they are now. It's just do something, right? Yeah. If you see a piece of trash on a trail that you're walking on, just pick it up and throw it away. It takes 3 seconds, right? That saves one animal from licking that piece of trash that they shouldn't be, right?
Choking on it.
Yeah, choking on it or something. One thing that I didn't know about until not too long ago is something that if you throw like an apple core out a window, right? You're driving down the road and you have this apple core, you've finished eating it and throw it out the window, right? That'll decompose fairly quickly, right? It's natural. A lot of people don't have any problem with that. But the one thing that I learned recently, and seems really obvious now that I've thought about it, is having that food near the road brings animals closer to the road and puts them in more danger, right? So like just thinking about that kind of like what seems like a small effect could bridge into something larger. And nobody's perfect. So there's no like, you can always strive to be better, but being perfect is not necessarily possible. So just try to be better as well. Every time you go up, think about it, pick up a piece of trash, do something small. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I've honestly, I've never thought about that either in terms of the apple core. I've definitely chucked
it seems so simple.
I've chucked my fair share of apple cores out the window, but now that you're saying that, I'm like, oh, that is kind of obvious, but I just never thought of that before, but that is great to keep in mind. So now I know. I really appreciate how you shared minimizing your impact. I think that's a really great way to go about it, because it's kind of like it's kind of like this in the sense of like plastic is a big problem, like in terms of just what do we do with it, our global waste and all of that. And so for me, that's one way in my life where I'm like, you know what, realistically, there's no way I'm going to get zero, like have zero impact when it comes to this. But it is something that wherever I can, I really try my best to minimize my use of plastics, right? So in whatever way I can, try to minimize all my one-time use plastics. So like things like my phone, I'm not necessarily going to be able to get away from that because that's how I make my livelihood, right? But things like one-time waste, I'll try to buy in bulk where I can, or I won't use plastic water bottles. I always have my refillable ones that I'm taking everywhere, and so things like that are really important. And I like how you mentioned that. And I also appreciate that you mentioned just kind of the polarization, and it feels like things are a lot that way. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of the biggest, I don't know what you want to call them, influencers, whatever that means, right? Like that term, or a lot of the biggest like creators or, politicians or whatever, a lot of times will take the very polarized views. And I think we've done kind of an injustice to a lot of people in that, because I think a lot of people still remain in this kind of middle ground area, but they're feeling like they need to take a very polarized stance. And so one of my hopes with like this channel and the podcast that I do have is that like when I have conversations like this, it's not a place where polarization is necessarily encouraged. I'd rather talk about problems, but also talk about them in like the reality of what they are, and not necessarily try to condemn a group of people, but rather just talk about how we can holistically solve a problem. So I like that your mind's there, and I appreciate you sharing that.
For sure.
So yeah, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate all the thoughts you shared today, and I know we got a little sidetracked in the end here, but it was a lot of good stuff. And looking forward to your work in the upcoming months and just continuing to see what you produce. So with your experience, kind of to wrap up, do competitions, like do they look like they are solidly in your future and you're going to be partaking in them in the upcoming months and years, or what does that feel like for you?
I think I'm always going to enter in the competitions, right? Do I feel like I'm going to win them? Probably not. But
and that'll be okay.
We're going to keep trying, right? And that's fine. Yeah. We'll see what they're like. And, I do this as a hobby and do it for fun, right? So I'm going to keep doing it. And if it brings more joy to doing this, then great. If it doesn't, then we'll stop. So
yeah.
But this one was fun. So probably join next year again and see how we do.
Yeah, most definitely. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for coming on and coming on the podcast today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Jeremy. It was great.